Hi, I'm Curtis Stursa of Winterbloom Farm, and today I wanted to talk about a group of plants that is probably a little familiar to everyone, but maybe also a little misunderstood, and those are the goldenrods, which I have here behind me. These plants are probably very familiar to a lot of people. They have this really prominent head of yellow flowers, and many of them have this straight stem with alternate simple leaves around the stalk, and then they just branch open like this at the top. Most goldenrods are in the genus Solidago, and all of them attract a wealth of insects when they're in flower. And there are about 20 species of these in Maine, and the flowers are actually compound flowers when you look at them carefully. What looks like plumes of flowers are actually made up of small flower heads, maybe about a half an inch or even smaller in diameter. And each of these, like other flowers in the aster family, are actually compound flowers made of disc florets in the center and ray florets on the outside. Now, because these plants bloom in late summer and into fall and bloom so prominently, they get blamed often for seasonal allergies and hay fever. But in fact, these bright yellow flowers are made to attract insects, and the pollen is heavy and it's sticky and it's not airborne. Unlike the pollen of grasses and other plants like this one, ragweed, that get into the air and can cause us allergies. And in fact, what's interesting about goldenrod is that it has all the plants in this genus have medicinal qualities that can actually help with allergies. The name of the genus, Solidago, comes from solidus ago in Latin, to make whole, to make solid, and it's a reference to all the medicinal uses of these plants. They have historically been used by the first peoples of this nation and by Western herbalists now for a variety of conditions. They help with respiratory issues, especially congestion in the sinus areas. So that's particularly helpful for allergy season. Also with the urinary and digestive tracts. Also for treating wounds topically. I'm not going to really get into the medicinal uses of the plant, but I do want to make it clear that this plant is sometimes wrongly vilified for our seasonal distress. But in fact, I don't know if you can see in the video now, but this is covered in bees and wasps and other insects, as are the asters in front of me, and these plants are really crucial this time of year. They're some of the few native plants that are flowering prominently, and they support a vast array of insects. So it's an important plant to keep around, and it's an important plant to try to incorporate into your wild areas and gardens if you can. And it does have a characteristic, it is characterized often as very weedy and spreads aggressively, and that's true of some species like Solidago canadensis, the Canada goldenrod. Behind me is another one, Solidago rugosa, the rough-stemmed goldenrod. These can get really aggressive in fields, sometimes in farm fields where they're not wanted. But there are other varieties of goldenrod that have much different behaviors, different characteristics, and I just want to spend a bit of time just showing you a few of those that I found around the farm, in case you're not already familiar with them. So we are in the woods to talk about another goldenrod species. This one is Solidago flexicalis, or zigzag goldenrod, so named because the stems have a tendency to zigzag a bit between the leaves. Though sometimes they grow a little bit more upright, you can see that zigzag characteristic here. As you can see, these are a lot shorter than other goldenrod species. These can get up to 3 feet tall, but they often are, like you see here, 1 to 2 feet tall, especially in shade, as we're in now. We're actually in a pretty good mixed hardwood canopy now. Not many openings, so this is actually the most shade tolerant of all the goldenrods, though it does do well in some sun, of course, too. It does do well also in moist soils. You can see all the moss here. We're actually in a stream bed that's gone dry this time of year, but is still pretty moist now and gets quite wet in the spring. And this goldenrod is quite happy here. It likes rich soil, though it can do well too in drier soils. I've grown it in the garden from seed, and it's gotten 3 feet tall. It's gotten quite much taller than these. I really like the leaves of this goldenrod. They have that green-blue color. They're almost heart-shaped, and they have a rough serrated margin, the edge. The flowers are a lot more um, they're a lot more individualized in some sense than the bigger goldenrods. They don't resemble that big fluffy wand of flowers. You can see the individual flower heads along this central axis. They also peek out along the leaf axils here. It's a much different kind of plant, but still quite lovely. As I said, not too hard to propagate from seed. It does well in garden settings. It won't spread everywhere. It forms clumps like this. It's just one of my favorites, and I'm always happy to find it in the wild, as we did here, and also to grow it in the garden. So it's a good one to consider. Solidago flexicalis. So this plant here is actually a goldenrod, though it doesn't look much like one, because of the whiter flowers, hence the Latin name Solidago bicolor. 2 colors, otherwise known as sometimes silver rod, white goldenrod. It is another goldenrod, of course, but the flowers are of a different color, so you might not take it for one. But the outer florets, the outer part of these flower heads are white and the inner part is gold. It's a pretty common goldenrod to forest edges and spaces like this where we're in right now, which is a path along the edge of a forest. I often see it blooming around roads, the edges of properties and things like that that might not get mowed often. It's not a very tall plant, maybe not the most spectacular of goldenrods, but I really like the color variation. I like the size of it. I think it's a beautiful plant and the pollinators love it. So it's another good one to know. Here's another goldenrod species that I wanted to point out, though this one's a little different. It's actually in a different genus. It is Euthymia graminifolia, sometimes called grass-leaved goldenrod. And it has gone by, unfortunately. It's one of the earlier blooming ones, earlier in the summer. And you can distinguish it from other goldenrods by these really grass-like lance-shaped leaves that have a prominent middle vein. And then if you look carefully, 2 veins on either side, a vein on either side of that. And the fluorescence of this one, if you imagine these as yellow flowers and not flowers that have gone by, it's much more flat-topped than the sometimes pyramidal shape that you get with other goldenrods. But it's quite common here in Maine and grows in a lot of various places that are open or disturbed along the edges of forests and meadows. We're on the edge of a forest trail here, so it's a good spot for it. So it's another one to keep in mind, even though it is not itself in the Solidago genus anymore. So here we're looking at more Solidago flexicalis, and I might have found in this wild part of our garden the plant I've been looking for, which sadly hasn't bloomed yet. But I believe this is Solidago cassia, otherwise known as blue-stemmed or wreath goldenrod, characterized by the fact that it has flowers all along the stem at every leaf node. As you can see, will be coming here. So I think we'll just have to show you a photo of what this really stunning goldenrod looks like when it's in flower, because unfortunately we don't have any yet at the farm. And finally, here is a Solidago nemoralis, or gray goldenrod, which is shorter and a little hairier actually on the leaves and the stem than other versions of other varieties of goldenrod. And that pretty much concludes our tour of just various goldenrods around our property. You know, I was at a meeting of horticultural professionals and plant breeders recently, and one of the veterans in the field remarked that he couldn't believe people are buying goldenrod. You know, it's just this idea that it's just a wild weed. Why are people buying it? And it's true that it is already probably in your area, right? It's already widespread. It's already growing maybe in your field or on the side of the road. And if that's the case, I say just let it grow, because it's a beautiful flower that serves a lot of beneficial ecological purposes and really requires very little, if not any, intervention from us. In fact, it requires us to not intervene at all. If I mowed this field regularly, these goldenrods wouldn't come up. But it's also a good plant to consider buying or incorporating, especially if there's a variety that you would like to have on your property because of its beauty or of its particular characteristics. And there is seed available. There are plants available from our farm and from others as well. that you can easily plant and incorporate. And the lovely thing about native plants such as these is they usually, if they're sited correctly in the sort of environment that they like and the conditions that they like, they'll grow well on their own and they won't need much maintenance or care from you. So they're just a wonderful variety of plants. One of my favorites, hands down, and I hope you can find ways to incorporate more goldenrods in your life as well.